Being rich in medieval times wasn't quite the dream you might imagine. Yes, there were castles with tall stone towers, tapestries that shimmered in candlelight, and long feasts that stretched late into the night. But beneath all that splendor, life for the wealthy was a complicated web of duty, fear, and endless expectation. The castle walls that promised safety were cold and damp, and the air inside often smelled of smoke, sweat, and tallow candles. There were no soft beds as we know them today's, just straw mattresses covered in coarse linen, and blankets that were heavy but rarely clean. The idea of comfort was very different back then. Even for the rich, life was more about survival than luxury. You might own 100 servants, but you couldn't command away disease, superstition, or the constant anxiety of betrayal. To be rich in the Middle Ages was to live inside a performance. Every action, every gesture was watched by others, your knights, your servants, your guests, and your rivals. You ate from silver plates, not because food tasted better that way, but because it showed power. You wore fur-lined robes in summer, even when they made you sweat, just to remind everyone of your status. Yet, that same status came with invisible chains. You couldn't simply walk outside and enjoy a market day among the common people. You couldn't wander the woods without guards or go unnoticed in a tavern. You were always someone important, and that meant you were never truly free. The peasants envied the lords, but the lords, in their quiet moments, sometimes envied the peasants, those who could laugh loudly, speak carelessly, and sleep without the weight of legacy pressing on their chests. Inside the grand halls, the sound of feasting could be heard, cups clinking, dogs barking under the table, the chatter of nobles and musicians filling the smoky air. It all looked magnificent from the outside, but the truth was, even these lavish dinners were riddled with danger. Food was often spoiled or tainted. Meat was salted until it was almost too tough to chew. Bread was coarse and sometimes mixed with ground beans or even sawdust. Spices were the mark of wealth: pepper, saffron, cinnamon, but they were used as much to cover bad flavors as to impress guests. And at the head of the table sat the lord or lady, smiling politely, knowing that one wrong word or a poisoned cup could end everything in a single evening. The biggest fear of the rich was not hunger, it was betrayal. Power created enemies. A cousin who smiled too often could be plotting your downfall. A servant who bowed too deeply might be loyal to someone else. Letters had to be written carefully, alliances maintained with gifts, and marriages arranged with calculation rather than affection. Even among family, trust was rare. Wealth attracted both admiration and hatred, and sometimes they looked exactly the same. Behind the laughter of court life was an undercurrent of suspicion that never truly went away. You learned to sleep lightly, to notice who avoided your gaze, who whispered in corners, who left a feast early, and yet the rich had to keep up appearances. There were tournaments to host, banquets to sponsor, and debts to pay. The display of wealth was a kind of armor. To show weakness was to invite attack, literal or political. Lords would spend fortunes they didn't have just to appear powerful enough to deter rebellion. A new set of armor for a knight, a golden goblet for a visiting baron, a wedding feast that lasted a week. All of it cost money, and often more than a noble could afford. But the alternative, looking poor, was worse. Reputation mattered more than comfort. And many noble families quietly went broke, trying to maintain the illusion of grandeur. Then there was religion. For the rich, it was both a comfort and a curse. The church taught that wealth was dangerous for the soul, that those who had much must give much away or face damnation. A noble could build a chapel, donate to a monastery, or pay for stained glass windows in hopes of buying forgiveness. But no matter how much gold was given, the guilt remained. Priests preached about humility to audiences dressed in silk, and even the most pious lord wondered if his fortune was a test or a trap. Death came for everyone, rich and poor alike, and no amount of treasure could bribe it away. Even love was complicated. Marriages were contracts, not choices. A young lady might be promised to a man she barely knew, his lands joining hers in a political knot neither of them could untie. A young lord might be told that his bride was beautiful, only to discover that beauty mattered little compared to the dowry she brought. Affairs were common, whispered about but never admitted. Scandal was a weapon, and one rumor could destroy an entire lineage. Behind the stone walls, hearts ached in silence, while duty smiled for the crowd. At night, when the torches were snuffed out, and only the distant howl of wolves could be heard, the castle became eerily quiet. You could hear the dripping of water through the walls, the scurrying of rats, the creak of wood settling. Even the rich slept uneasily. Dreams were filled with omens, prophecies, and the haunting faces of those lost to plague or war. And when the sun rose again, there was no time for reflection, only the endless repetition of duty: to manage estates, to attend councils, to maintain appearances. Life was long for the rich, but rarely peaceful. The peasants might have envied the silks, the banquets, and the gold rings, but the truth was simple. Wealth in medieval times was a burden as much as a blessing. It demanded loyalty that could never be trusted, splendor that could never be satisfied, and faith that could never be certain. Behind every smiling portrait of a nobleman in history lies a story of exhaustion, of a life lived under constant watch, bound by expectation and haunted by the knowledge that fortune could vanish as quickly as it came. Being born into nobility sounded like a blessing, but it was, in truth, a quiet curse. From the moment a noble child took their first breath, their life was no longer their own. Every smile, every gesture, every word spoken was a reflection of the family's honor. The crown they were destined to wear, whether literal or symbolic, was already being forged for them. The lessons began early, not about joy or curiosity, but about manners, posture, and restraint. A noble child learned how to walk properly before they were allowed to run. They learned when to bow, when to speak, and more importantly, when to stay silent. Servants would dress them each morning in layers of stiff, embroidered fabric that itched against their skin, and they would be reminded, softly but constantly, that comfort was not their purpose. Their purpose was to represent, in the cold, great halls where they were raised, laughter was rare and discipline constant. The air always smelled faintly of stone, candle wax, and the smoke from the great hearth that struggled to keep the chill away. They would eat their meals at long tables under watchful eyes, careful not to spill, chew too loudly, or ask for more than what was given. The servants would hover, silent and invisible, moving with precision born of fear of doing something wrong, fear of a noble's temper, fear of losing their position. And while the servants feared the nobles, in turn, feared failure. A single mistake could bring shame upon a name that had lasted for generations. As they grew older, the pressure only deepened. A young lord was taught the art of politics long before he learned the art of kindness. He was trained to hide his emotions behind polite words and carefully measured expressions. A young lady, meanwhile, was taught how to dance, how to sew, and how to flatter men who might one day control her fate. She was told that beauty was her greatest weapon and silence her greatest virtue. Both learned that trust was dangerous. Allies could turn into rivals, friends into enemies, and words once spoken could never be taken back. And so they built their lives behind masks. Politeness became armor, courtesy a weapon. At feasts and gatherings, they smiled and bowed, exchanging compliments that were half lies and half threats. Every conversation was a chessboard, every relationship a transaction. To show too much kindness was to seem weak. To show too much ambition was to seem dangerous. The ideal noble was calm, detached, and unreadable, a statue wrapped in silk. Beneath that surface, however, hearts beat fast, filled with envy, anxiety, and an ever-present awareness that one's fortune could turn overnight. The king or queen, sitting high on their throne, seemed to embody the height of this world, the richest of the rich, the most powerful of all. But even they were prisoners of their crowns. A ruler could command armies, yet be powerless against gossip. They could issue decrees, yet tremble at rumors of rebellion. They could feast in gold-lined halls, yet never eat without tasting fear. Every toast might hide poison, every smile a dagger. Sleep for royalty was never peaceful. Even the bedchamber had guards outside the door and a dagger under the pillow. The weight of nobility was not just political, it was spiritual. The church, the ever-present force of the Middle Ages, whispered reminders of sin and judgment into noble ears. To be rich was to be suspect. Wealth, the priests warned, was a temptation, a distraction from God's will. Confession became routine, and charity became a kind of insurance for the soul. Nobles built churches, funded abbeys, and commissioned paintings not only to show devotion, but to ease the guilt that came from their privilege. They feared not just rebellion or disease, but damnation, an invisible punishment waiting beyond death. Even pleasure carried risk. Feasts meant indulgence, but also danger. Drinking too much could loosen tongues. Dancing too close could spark scandal. The medieval court was full of eyes and ears, and every word spoken was weighed by someone, somewhere. A misplaced joke could lead to disgrace. A careless affair could destroy a marriage alliance. To live as a noble was to live under a microscope made of rumor and reputation. And then there was the constant, gnawing reminder that wealth could vanish. One bad harvest, one failed war, one shift in royal favor, and everything could crumble. Castles were expensive to maintain. Armies demanded coin. Taxes were unpredictable, and debts piled high. Many noble families found themselves drowning in the illusion of wealth, surrounded by gold objects and fine clothing, but secretly borrowing from merchants or pawning heirlooms to pay their servants. Pride forbade them from admitting it, of course, so they smiled wider, feasted louder, and prayed that no one would notice the cracks forming beneath the marble floors. The irony of nobility was that the higher you climbed, the lonelier you became. True friendship was rare, and genuine laughter even rarer. Every ally was temporary, every favor conditional. Even within families, love was tangled in politics. Fathers treated sons as heirs before children. Daughters were bartered like land. Wives became tools of diplomacy, husbands symbols of lineage. Every bond had a purpose, and when that purpose was fulfilled, affection often faded like candle smoke. When night fell, the castle corridors echoed with a kind of hollow quiet. Behind heavy oak doors, nobles removed their jewels and fine robes, and for a brief moment they were just people, tired, anxious, often afraid. The cold of the stone walls seeped into their bones, a quiet reminder that beneath all the velvet and ceremony, they were still fragile flesh and blood. And in those quiet, sleepless hours, when the torches burned low and the world outside was wrapped in darkness, even the most powerful of them would sometimes ask the same question that haunted their peasants: was all this truly worth it? Life for the rich in medieval times might have looked grand, but inside the walls of their castles, it often felt more like a prison than a palace. The walls were high, yes, tall enough to keep out enemies, but they also kept in silence. Days were filled with ceremony, meetings, and obligation, leaving no room for freedom or privacy. Even the smallest act, where to sit at the table, what to wear, whom to greet, first was dictated by custom. There were rules for how to bow, how to speak, how to laugh. A nobleman could not simply be. He had to perform a version of himself that matched the expectations of his title. And so, day by day, the castle became a stage, and the noble became an actor trapped in a role he could never escape. The mornings began early, long before the sun had climbed over the stone battlements. Servants would enter quietly, carrying basins of cold water for washing, laying out clothes stiff with embroidery and lined with fur. The master of the house would rise slowly, already tired before the day began. He might glance toward the window, wishing he could step outside unnoticed, feel the earth beneath his feet, breathe air that wasn't thick with the smell of smoke and oil. But there was always someone waiting, a steward with accounts to approve, a messenger with news, a priest ready to remind him of duty. Life for the rich was never still. It was an endless cycle of control disguised as privilege. Breakfast was a formal affair, even if it consisted of nothing more than stale bread dipped in watered wine. Every gesture mattered. A lord might exchange polite words with his wife, though their eyes rarely met. Servants stood silently along the walls, watching, waiting for the smallest signal. They knew better than to speak. Silence was safety. The children, if they were present, sat stiffly, mimicking their parents' posture, learning early that nobility came not from birth alone, but from obedience. A child who laughed too loudly or fidgeted too much would be scolded, not cruelly, but coldly reminded that they were heirs, not children. The rest of the day was a pattern of routine, managing estates, hearing petitions, writing letters to distant allies or enemies. A noble's handwriting had to be elegant, his words careful, his seal perfectly pressed. Every document carried weight. Every word could be used against him. He might stroll through his gardens, but even there, the beauty felt controlled, hedges trimmed into shapes, flowers arranged by servants. Nature itself had to obey. In the distance, peasants toiled in fields, their laughter carried faintly by the wind. He would watch them sometimes, not with envy exactly, but with a kind of wistfulness. They were poor, yes, but their lives belonged to themselves. They could speak freely, love freely, move freely. He, in all his wealth, could do none of those things, and yet appearances had to be maintained. The castle had to remain a place of wonder and fear, a symbol of power. Visitors might arrive, another noble family, perhaps, or a royal envoy, and the household would burst into motion. Tapestries were shaken free of dust, goblets polished until they gleamed, candles lit until the halls glowed golden. The noble would don his finest robes, heavy and uncomfortable, stitched with gold thread that scratched the skin. He would smile, bow, flatter, and play his part perfectly. There was no room for mistakes. Every visit was a test, every conversation a delicate negotiation. Even the smallest gesture could shift alliances or spark suspicion. But when the guests left and the doors closed, silence returned like a shadow. The servants retreated to their quarters, the fires burned low, and the echo of laughter faded. The noble would walk the halls alone, the click of his boots sounding almost too loud in the emptiness. He might pause by a window, looking out at the dark landscape beyond the forest, the villages, the winding river under the moon. All that land, all those lives, belonged to him. And yet, somehow, it felt as though he belonged to them, to the land, to the title, to the name that bound him tighter than any chain. For noble women, the cage was even smaller. A lady of wealth lived surrounded by beauty silks, jewelry, perfumes, but her world rarely extended beyond the castle walls. She was expected to be graceful, pure, obedient, and always watchful of her reputation. A whispered rumor could ruin her, no matter how false. She embroidered to pass the time, or read aloud from religious texts, her thoughts wandering to places she would never see. Sometimes she would stand by the window, looking down at the courtyard, watching servants and soldiers come and go. Their lives seemed hard, but they moved, they lived beyond the same stone walls she had known since childhood. Her luxury was a kind of stillness, beautiful but suffocating. Even the grand feasts, with all their splendor, could not break the monotony. The laughter was loud but hollow, the food rich but repetitive. The musicians played, the wine flowed, and yet every noble in the room was thinking the same thought: who will rise and who will fall next? Jealousy glittered more brightly than the jewels. Friendships were fragile, alliances fragile still. A single insult, reel or imagine, could spark years of quiet revenge. The worst part of being rich wasn't hunger or hardship. It was never knowing sincerity. Every compliment might hide a motive, every friendship a plot. Even servants who smiled and bowed might report to another master. The nobleman could never truly relax. His life was one long performance for an audience that never applauded, and when death finally came, it too was wrapped in ceremony. A nobleman's funeral was grand, his body dressed in fine clothes, his tomb carved with his likeness. But beneath all that marble and gold lay the same truth that haunted every life in the Middle Ages: death made equals of everyone. The same worms that feasted on a peasant would feast on a king. The gilded cage, in the end, was still just a cage. To be rich in the Middle Ages was to live behind a mask. Every day began not with thought or prayer, but with preparation, a ritual of transformation from human to symbol. The nobleman's body was not his own. It was a display, a living emblem of power and wealth. Every thread he wore, every ring that gleamed on his hand, every ribbon in his hair, it all spoke to the world, declaring his status before he even opened his mouth. But this beauty came at a cost. Comfort, warmth, and freedom were traded for fashion, reputation, and fear of disgrace. The first hour of the morning belonged to his attendants. They entered his chamber quietly, bowing low before speaking. One laid out his garments, another brushed and oiled his hair, while a third polished the buckle of his belt until it shone. The nobleman stood still through it all, gazing at his reflection in the polished bronze mirror, a face he barely recognized. The skin pale from lack of sunlight, the eyes weary, the expression empty. It was the face of a man who lived for others' eyes. Dressing was no simple act. Every layer had a meaning. A linen undershirt first, soft against the skin but quickly soaked in sweat. Then came the hose, the doublet, and the surcoat, all stitched with thread dyed from plants that peasants would never touch. The fabrics were costly, but the weight was suffocating. In summer, the nobleman felt like a prisoner inside his own clothes. Yet he endured it without complaint. Appearance was everything. To look anything less than regal was to invite whispers, whispers that could travel farther and faster than any arrow. The same burden haunted noblewomen, perhaps even more cruelly. A lady's worth was measured by her beauty, but beauty itself was a fragile currency. To maintain it, she endured hours of preparation, powders made of chalk or lead, perfumes so strong they clung to the air, and dresses that squeezed the ribs until breathing became shallow. Her hair, twisted into elaborate designs, was pinned so tightly it ached by noon. Even her gestures had to be rehearsed. How to smile just enough, how to lower her gaze, how to walk so that her gown swept elegantly across the floor without tripping her. One misstep could make her the subject of gossip for months. Meals were no escape from this theater of image. The dining hall glittered with candlelight, yet beneath the gold and silver there was tension. A nobleman could not simply eat. He had to perform the act of eating. He must sit straight, cut neatly, chew silently. He must not lick his fingers or drink too quickly, for such things were signs of vulgarity. Even laughter had to be measured, soft enough to be graceful, loud enough to seem sociable. Every noble at the table was watching every other, searching for the smallest crack in composure. A dropped spoon, a stain on one's sleeve, even a yawn could signal weakness. And when it came to hosting feasts, the burden grew even heavier. Nobles competed to outshine one another with extravagance. A simple dinner could become a display of excess roasted swans, gilded pastries, fountains of spiced wine. The guests would gasp, murmur praises, and yet, secretly, they would compare. Who had the larger hall? Whose musicians played better? Whose wine was older? The feast wasn't about pleasure, it was about power. The nobleman could never relax, for even a moment of modesty could be mistaken for poverty. Behind the scenes, servants worked tirelessly to uphold this illusion. Cooks toiled in the smoky kitchens. Maids polished silver until their hands blistered, and stewards ran through corridors, ensuring everything was perfect. None of their faces were remembered, yet every one of them was responsible for maintaining the noble's image. A single failure, a dish gone cold, a candle sputtering out, could result in punishment. Reputation, after all, depended on perfection. But what was all this perfection worth? In private, many nobles confessed, though only to priests, that they felt hollow. They could not speak freely, love freely, or even age freely. The expectation of appearance followed them into old age. A man with a limp might be mocked behind his back, a woman with wrinkles quietly avoided. They were living portraits, admired from afar, but empty within. Even leisure was not truly leisure. Hunting, for example, was a noble pastime. But it wasn't about the thrill of the chase. It was about showing control, grace, and authority. A nobleman who missed his shot too often risked looking weak. One who killed too ruthlessly seemed barbaric. Every action had to balance between elegance and strength. It was exhausting. Music and poetry, too, served the same purpose. A lady might be expected to sing or play an instrument, but only songs of refinement, never those sung by commoners. A lord might recite verses, but they had to flatter his lineage or praise his guests. Sincerity had no place in such displays. Even art was chained by reputation. The greatest irony was that the poor, whom nobles pitied or despised, lived lives that were, in some ways, more honest. Their hardships were real, but so were their joys. They could speak, shout, dance, and laugh without fear of scandal. A noble might look down from his window and see peasants sharing bread after a long day, their laughter carried by the wind. He would never admit it, but part of him envied that sound, a sound unshaped by etiquette, unguarded and free. The burden of appearance was more than a social weight. It was a spiritual one. Nobles were told that their wealth was a gift from God, but also a test. To fail in maintaining dignity was to fail in divine duty. Thus, they prayed not for mercy or humility, but for poise, grace, and the strength to endure the endless scrutiny of others. And so, each night, as candles flickered low, a nobleman would kneel beside his bed, whispering words not of gratitude, but of exhaustion. Let them see what they wish to see, and let them never see what I feel. Beneath the glittering chandeliers and gold-threaded curtains of medieval manners, a quiet sorrow lingered, a loneliness so deep that even the richest tapestries could not conceal it. Nobility, for all its grandeur, was an existence wrapped in isolation. The nobleman and noblewoman lived in a gilded cage, surrounded by people yet truly known by none. Every friendship was a transaction, every smile a performance, and every conversation a careful dance of power, loyalty, and deceit. The great halls that hosted feasts and ceremonies were rarely empty, but they were never intimate. Dozens of guests filled the room, their laughter echoing through the stone walls. Yet each one was measuring the other, weighing alliances and rivalries. A noble could be surrounded by hundreds, yet feel utterly alone, for no one spoke from the heart. Every compliment was layered with calculation. Every gesture of friendship hid the shadow of ambition. A misplaced word, a too honest opinion, could destroy years of careful image building. So they spoke politely, they smiled graciously, and they trusted no one. Even within families, warmth was scarce. Marriages among nobles were rarely born from love. They were contracts, alliances woven by politics, dowries, and bloodlines. A young noblewoman might meet her husband for the first time on her wedding day, her hands trembling as she vowed eternal devotion to a man twice her age. Her tears would be hidden behind a painted smile, her hopes sealed away with the closing of the chapel doors. As for the husband, he might see in her not a partner, but a symbol of wealth, of connection, of power. Their bond, if it grew, was often one of duty rather than affection. Children, too, were victims of this lonely privilege. Noble offspring were raised not by their parents, but by tutors and servants. From the moment they could walk, they were taught to behave as little adults, their laughter subdued, their curiosity curbed. They were told what to wear, what to say, and even what to dream. Play was considered unworthy. Education, obedience, and posture were prized above all. A young noble might long for a parent's embrace, but the lord and lady were too busy maintaining appearances. Love was expressed through expectation, not tenderness. And when those same children grew older, they carried the same emptiness forward. Sons were sent off to war or to court, their worth measured by their bravery or charm. Daughters were married away, often to foreign lands where they knew no one, becoming strangers in distant castles. Letters home were rare and heavily censored. Loneliness, by then, had become a habit, a quiet ache they learned to conceal behind noble pride. Even in leisure, solitude followed. The gardens of castles, with their carefully arranged hedges and still fountains, offered peace but also silence. A noble might stroll there alone, hearing only the echo of his own footsteps and the distant murmur of servants. The beauty of his surroundings mocked him, all this splendor, and yet no one to share it sincerely. He could not laugh too freely with his servants. Familiarity would blur the boundaries of class. He could not open his heart to his peers. Honesty would make him vulnerable. So he walked alone, beneath the arching trees, his thoughts, his only companions. At night, the loneliness deepened. The vast chambers, lit by a single flickering candle, felt less like rooms and more like tombs. The tapestries, meant to bring warmth, only absorbed the silence. The noble might hear distant laughter from the servants' quarters, a reminder that joy existed somewhere, but not for him. His bed was large enough for two, yet often he slept alone, either estranged from his spouse or separated by cold formalities. Even religion, the supposed comfort of the age, could not fill the void. The nobleman's prayers were public spectacles, performed for the eyes of others. His piety was measured in donations, in the number of candles he lit, or the chapels he built. But when he knelt alone, his words often faltered. He could confess his sins to the priest, but not his sorrow. The church taught him that his suffering was a test of virtue, a sign of humility before God. Yet he couldn't help wondering why the poorest seemed to laugh more freely than he ever could. There were moments when that loneliness cracked the mask. A noblewoman might, in the dead of night, slip into the servants' hall just to hear laughter that wasn't forced. A nobleman might secretly visit the stables, talking to his horses in the way he could never talk to people. These small rebellions were dangerous, but they were human. And sometimes, in those brief moments, they remembered what it felt like to be ordinary, to smile without calculation, to speak without fear. But dawn always came, and with it, duty. The noble had to put his mask back on to attend councils, settle disputes, and host guests. The loneliness became part of him, a quiet ache that lived beneath his fine clothes and jeweled rings. Some drowned it in wine, others in prayer. A few tried to escape it through art, sponsoring poets, painters, or musicians, in the hope that beauty might soothe what wealth could not. But even art had its limits. In truth, the loneliness of the nobility was not born from lack of company, but from lack of authenticity. Every relationship was filtered through hierarchy. Every act of kindness was suspect. Every word weighed. Trust was a luxury they could not afford. The very power that elevated them also isolated them, turning their castles into prisons built of pride. And so the noble lived, surrounded by people, yet untouched by real affection, adored, envied, and utterly alone. The peasants outside the castle walls, huddled around their fires, might have envied his wealth. But if they could have seen inside his heart, they would have pitied him instead. Power in the medieval world was like fire, beautiful, dangerous, and impossible to hold for long without getting burned. For the rich nobles who lived in high stone castles, their greatest fear was not poverty nor sickness, but betrayal. Every alliance was fragile, every servant a potential spy, and every smile might hide a dagger. Wealth brought admiration, but it also invited hatred, and that hatred often wore the face of a friend in the glittering courts of medieval Europe. Politics was not fought only on battlefields. It was waged in whispers. A noble might lose everything: title, land, even life, not through war, but through rumor. The more powerful the lord, the more dangerous his shadow became. Rivals waited for the smallest sign of weakness: a late tax payment, a slight insult, a failed harvest. Any misstep could be twisted into accusation. A noble who was once praised could find himself condemned overnight. His name dragged through corridors like a cursed echo. Every feast, every council meeting, every royal audience was a performance of restraint. Nobles smiled at one another across long wooden tables, their goblets raised, but their eyes were sharp, measuring, and cold. They toasted peace while plotting war, exchanged gifts while planning revenge. To survive among them required not just wealth, but cunning, the ability to read the smallest twitch of a mouth, the faintest tremor in a voice. Trust was a rare currency, and even blood ties did not guarantee safety. Brothers betrayed brothers, cousins turned on cousins, and marriages meant to unite families often ignited old feuds instead. The danger did not always come from equals. A noble's household, the very people who made his comfort possible, could also be his undoing. Servants were invisible until they chose not to be. They overheard secrets, saw hidden letters, and carried food and drink to their masters' tables. One poisoned cup, one misplaced word, one bribe from an enemy, and everything could collapse. Many nobles slept lightly, their daggers near at hand. The locks on their doors were not just for thieves, but for the people who served them. Some nobles tried to protect themselves with generosity. They threw lavish feasts, paid their servants well, donated to churches. But even kindness could not erase envy. The poor saw the castles glittering above their villages, the banquets that wasted more food in a night than a peasant family could eat in a month. Resentment brewed quietly in the fields and taverns. The nobleman's wealth made him a target not only for thieves, but for history itself. For whenever famine or plague struck, people sought someone to blame. And who better than the one who had everything? Yet the worst envy often came not from below, but from above. Kings and queens, ever wary of their vassals, watched the rich with suspicion. A noble who grew too powerful might be accused of treason. One who showed too much independence might lose his lands to royal decree. A favor from the crown could turn into a death sentence if it drew jealousy from the wrong courtier. The corridors of castles were as treacherous as any battlefield, and the weapons there were silence, flattery, and rumor. Even the church, which promised salvation, could be a source of fear. A single accusation of heresy, of immoral living, or of withholding tithes could bring ruin. Many nobles built chapels, not out of devotion, but as armor against suspicion. They paid priests to pray for their souls, but also to protect their reputations. Faith became another transaction, another shield in a world full of invisible daggers. For noblewomen, the dangers took different forms. A single scandal, real or imagined, could destroy a lady's honor and her family's standing. A jealous rival might spread whispers that she had taken a lover, or insulted a higher-born lady, or simply worn the wrong colors at court. Once the rumor began, there was no defense strong enough to stop it. Her beauty, once a symbol of status, became a weapon turned against her. Many noble women retreated into quiet seclusion, spending their days in prayer, embroidery, and the dull safety of invisibility. Even wealth itself carried curses. The gold that filled the coffers brought more burden than joy. It had to be guarded, counted, and displayed in the right measure. Too much, and one invited suspicion. Too little, and one appeared weak. The noble's fortune was never truly his own. It was a living thing that demanded constant feeding through taxes, rents, and trade. A single failed harvest, a storm that sank a ship, a war that lasted too long, and centuries of inheritance could vanish. Families that had ruled for generations could find themselves ruined within a year. And yet, perhaps the cruelest danger of all was the slow erosion of the soul. The rich noble learned to distrust everyone, even himself. He could not afford compassion. It was too easily exploited. He could not afford anger. It revealed too much. So he became careful, restrained, and cold. His laughter was measured, his sorrow hidden. Over time, he forgot what it meant to feel freely. Power had given him everything, and taken away everything that mattered. When he died, often young, for stress and poison were constant companions. His body was laid in an ornate tomb, carved with angels and lions. But the peasants who walked by it would whisper stories. Some called him generous, others cruel. In truth, neither mattered. His name, like all the others, became just another echo in the long corridors of history. The fire of power burned bright, but it left behind only ashdot, far from the marble tombs and jeweled halls. A poor farmer might look up at the same night sky, content with his simple meal and the laughter of his children. He would never know that the noble who ruled his land, the man of power, wealth, and prestige, had envied him all along. Luxury, to the peasants of medieval Europe, it was the dream of dreams. Silk gowns, roasted meats, gold cups, velvet cushions, and warm fires, things they could only imagine as they toiled in the mud. Yet for those who actually lived surrounded by such things, the dream was not as golden as it seemed. Every luxury carried its own curse. Every comfort had a hidden cost. To be rich was to be constantly reminded that everything could be lost, and that even the softest bed could become a place of restlessness and regret. The castle, that towering symbol of noble power, was not as comfortable as it appeared. The walls were cold, the windows narrow, and the stone floors unforgiving beneath fine rugs. In winter, the wind howled through the halls like a ghost, and the fires, though grand, could barely warm the vast chambers. Nobles wrapped themselves in layers of fur and silk, but still their hands went numb. They dined beside roaring flames, yet their breath turned to mist in the air. To keep warm, servants burned wood by the cartload, but even that was never enough. The castle was a fortress, not a home. Their beds, heavy with embroidered curtains and stuffed mattresses, looked inviting but rarely brought rest. The nobleman lay awake, listening for footsteps in the dark, fearing assassins or thieves. The noblewoman, too, lay sleepless, her mind weighed by gossip and the endless pressure to remain flawless. Dreams came rarely. When they did, they were often troubled. Wealth brought food, shelter, and servants, but it also brought 1,000 invisible burdens that no peasant could imagine. The very food that displayed their status was often a source of discomfort. The feasts were magnificent: peacocks roasted whole, fish glazed in honey, bread shaped like crowns. But these dishes were more spectacle than nourishment. They were heavy, greasy, and rich beyond measure. Spices from distant lands were used in excess to show off wealth, not taste. Nobles ate for hours, swallowing more than their bodies could bear, all while pretending to enjoy it. Indigestion, gout, and stomach ailments were common among the rich. To refuse food would seem ungrateful or suspicious. To eat it was to suffer quietly. The poor, with their simple bread and vegetables, often fared better in health than their masters. Luxury extended beyond food and clothing. Every aspect of noble life demanded display: the carriages lined with velvet, the jeweled belts, the golden embroidery that took weeks to stitch. But maintaining such splendor was exhausting. A nobleman could not wear the same garment twice to a royal feast without whispers. A lady could not repeat a necklace or gown without risking mockery. Their wardrobes were endless, but so were their anxieties. Tailors, jewelers, and craftsmen thrived, while the nobles who paid them sank deeper into the quiet panic of keeping up appearances. Even cleanliness, a luxury of the rich, was fraught with discomfort. Bathing required immense effort, heating barrels of water, preparing perfumes and herbs, ensuring privacy, and it was often done only for ceremony rather than comfort. The noble bath was not a place of relaxation, but of display. Servants stood nearby, attendants waited with towels, and sometimes guests were even invited to observe. It was less about feeling clean and more about looking refined. The irony was cruel. The peasants, who washed in rivers without fanfare, were freer than the nobles, who bathed under scrutiny, jewelry, and finery. Those shining symbols of wealth could also become chains. A noblewoman might spend hours being dressed, her neck heavy with gold, her fingers stiff from rings. Crowns and headdresses, though beautiful, often caused headaches from their weight. Shoes made of silk offered no comfort to walk on cold stone floors. Every luxury seemed designed for admiration rather than ease. And while peasants went barefoot in summer and felt the earth beneath their feet, the noblewoman floated through her own home as if made of glass, delicate, adorned, and disconnected from the world around her. There was also the mental toll, the endless comparison, the fear of falling behind. Nobles competed not only for wealth, but for elegance. Whose hall was grander? Whose feast more extravagant? Whose horse better bred? These questions consumed them. Their wealth was never enough because someone else always had more. The race to outshine one another had no finish line. Even kings and queens were not spared. Their courts were stages where everyone watched, judged, and schemed, and with luxury came moral decay. Many nobles grew indifferent to suffering. When comfort becomes constant, empathy begins to fade. A noble might walk past beggars on the road without a second glance, dismissing them as lazy or cursed. The distance between rich and poor grew not only in wealth, but in heart. Some nobles even began to believe that luxury was their divine right, that God himself had placed them above others. Yet, in their private chambers, doubts crept in. Was it really divine will, or just luck and cruelty disguised as destiny? The truth was that luxury dulled the soul as much as it delighted the senses. It demanded attention, protection, and endless worry. The rich lived surrounded by beauty they could no longer truly appreciate. The tapestry that once amazed them became just another wall covering. The jewels that once glimmered with wonder became heavy burdens. The constant abundance robbed even simple joys of meaning. And so, in the stillness of the night, when the music had faded and the candles burned low, a noble might walk alone through his grand hall, his footsteps echoing on marble. The gold, the silk, the silver, all of it shimmered faintly in the darkness, lifeless without the eyes of others to admire it. He would pause by the window, looking out at the sleeping village below, where the faint glow of a peasant's fire flickered through the mist. There, in that modest hut, laughter and warmth filled the air. The noble sighed, realizing that all his treasures could not buy that kind of peace. Luxury, in the end, was not freedom. It was a performance that never ended. To be rich was to live surrounded by beauty and haunted by emptiness, adored by the world, yet disconnected from the very life that made the world worth living. If the peasants lived by the laws of survival, the nobles lived by the laws of etiquette. In the medieval world, these rules were not written in stone, but they were just as powerful, invisible chains that bound every movement, every glance, every word. To be rich meant to live inside a world of constant observation. Nobility was not merely inherited through blood. It was performed every day through gestures, manners, and restraint. One misstep could ruin a family's reputation, turning admiration into mockery overnight. From the moment a noble woke, etiquette began to dictate his life. Even the act of rising from bed had its formality. Servants entered at the proper hour, never too early, never too late. They opened the shutters, brought water for washing, and offered garments in the correct order: underclothes first, then doublet, then surcoat. The nobleman could not simply throw on what he liked. Colors carried meanings: deep reds for power, blues for loyalty, greens for hope or youth. Wearing the wrong shade at the wrong occasion could send an unintended message. And in court politics, A wrong message could be fatal. At meals, the web of rules grew thicker. The noble's table was a theater of precision. He could not begin eating until the highest-ranking guest had taken the first bite. His knife could not touch his lips. He must tear bread, never cut it. His goblet was to be held by the stem, not the bowl. Speaking while chewing was unthinkable, and to drink too much wine risked humiliation. Even laughter had to be measured, soft, polite, never vulgar. A noble who forgot his manners, even in joy, could be seen as common. For noblewomen, etiquette was an even greater prison. Every step they took was watched. How they bowed, how they smiled, how they folded their hands, each movement carried meaning. They were taught to speak softly, to never contradict a man in public, to hide anger behind gentle words. A noblewoman could not simply rest her hand on a table. She had to let it hover gracefully, like a feather on the wind. To sit was an art, to walk a performance. Even her expression while listening to others was rehearsed. The irony was cruel. All this control was meant to display refinement, yet it stripped away freedom. The poor could laugh, sing, and eat with their hands. The noble had to pretend every act was divine ceremony. In the fields, peasants shouted across the wind, but in the castle hall, a noble had to weigh every word. Even silence was strategic. Too much, and one seemed cold. Too little, and one seemed foolish. To live among nobles was to be trapped in an endless dance of appearances. The rules of conversation were perhaps the most exhausting. A noble could not speak of certain topics, religion too freely, money too directly, politics too bluntly. Flattery was expected, but sincerity was dangerous. A well-placed compliment could open doors. An honest opinion could close them forever. Gossip was both a weapon and a survival tool. To know the latest whisper was to have power. To be its subject was to risk ruin. Words were sharper than swords in the noble courts, and far deadlier. Even the body itself became a battleground of control. A nobleman was expected to move with grace even when exhausted. His gestures had to flow like poetry. No sudden movements, no visible frustration. Pain or discomfort could not show on his face. If a feast lasted 10 hours, he must sit straight and attentive the entire time. A lady might be wearing a gown that crushed her ribs, yet she must smile through the pain. Their faces became masks, trained to express only what etiquette allowed. The church reinforced these rules, cloaking them in divine authority. Nobility, it was said, came with responsibility to act as examples of God's order on earth. To behave improperly was not just rude, it was sinful. Priests preached about dignity and moderation, reminding nobles that they were born to represent heaven's hierarchy. But this only deepened the cage. Even faith became another layer of control, a reminder that one must always appear humble, even when surrounded by gold. Behind closed doors, however, cracks appeared. Servants whispered of noblemen who lost their tempers, of ladies who wept after public humiliation, of feasts that ended in drunken shouting. But none of this could be acknowledged. In the daylight, everyone pretended perfection. The mask had to stay intact. It was exhausting, not physically, but spiritually. Nobles lived so tightly wound by rules that they forgot what it meant to feel natural. Travel, when it happened, brought only temporary relief. Even outside the castle, etiquette followed. how to greet a host, how to enter a room, when to remove one's hat. All of it mattered. If a noble visited another court, he had to memorize dozens of new customs or risk insult. The world of the rich was a minefield of manners, and every misstep could detonate scandal. And then came the royal court, the pinnacle of control. To be in the presence of the king or queen was to live under invisible chains. A noble could not speak unless spoken to. He had to bow at the perfect angle, his eyes lowered just enough to show respect, but not submission. To turn one's back too quickly, to sigh too loudly, to wear the wrong jewel, all could be interpreted as rebellion. Many courtiers fainted from anxiety more than heat, their bodies trembling under the weight of expectation. This constant performance carved hollowness into their souls. Life became an act, and they the unwilling actors. Even love had to be polite, passion subdued to proper form, to laugh genuinely, to cry openly, to embrace freely. These were luxuries the poor could afford, but the rich could not. A noble might spend decades mastering etiquette, only to realize he had forgotten who he truly was beneath it all. And so, as night fell and the candles dimmed, the noble would retreat from the grand hall to his private chamber, exhaling only once the door closed behind him. There, in solitude, he might slump in his chair, unbutton his collar, and finally breathe without worrying how it looked. For a few quiet moments, he could exist not as a lord or lady, but as a tired human being. But even that freedom was brief, for in the morning, the mask would return, polished and perfect, ready for another day of graceful imprisonment. We often imagine medieval nobles surrounded by endless pleasure, gold goblets, banquets overflowing with roasted meats, minstrels singing softly in candlelight. But beneath that glittering surface, life for the rich was far from joyful. The very luxury they chased became their prison, the comfort that dulled their hearts. In the soft flicker of torchlight and the endless echo of harp strings, many nobles found not happiness, but emptiness, a quiet sorrow wrapped in silk. To be rich in the medieval world was to live constantly surrounded by performance. Even in moments of supposed leisure, nothing was genuine. Feasts were grand, but not spontaneous. Every dish, every gesture, every smile was planned to display power. The laughter that filled the halls was measured, the stories rehearsed, the wine poured only to remind others of wealth. These events were not for enjoyment, they were for display. Each feast was a political stage where alliances were woven and betrayals whispered between courses. Imagine the great hall of a castle during a feast, the air thick with the smell of roasted boar and spiced wine, tapestries fluttering gently as servants move silently along the walls. At first glance, it looks like joy, music, dancing, abundance. But beneath the beauty lies anxiety. Every noble knows he's being watched, how much he eats, how much he drinks, whom he chooses to dance with. All of it matters. The feast is not freedom, it's theater. Even laughter must be careful, and pleasure must never cross into indulgence. For many nobles, true enjoyment had to be hidden. Behind closed doors, away from the eyes of the court, they might allow themselves a rare breath of honesty, a walk in the garden at night, a forbidden book, a song sung quietly by a servant. These small moments of simplicity were treasures more valuable than any jewel. yet they were also dangerous. To enjoy something that was not approved, to show affection for something humble, could mark one as eccentric or weak, and so even their pleasures were filtered through fear. The rich were surrounded by art, music, and beauty, yet much of it was created not for the soul, but for status. A noble might commission a painter to immortalize his face, but he would never truly smile for the portrait. He would sit still, dressed in heavy robes, surrounded by symbols of wealth, a falcon, a sword, a family crest. The art was not about him, it was about power. The music played in his hall was not to comfort his heart, but to announce his prestige. Even the gardens outside his windows were arranged for admiration, not for peace. Over time, the endless display dulled the spirit. The poor struggled to survive, but their lives at least had purpose: to work, to provide, to love, to dream. The nobles, cushioned from hardship, drifted through empty routines. They had everything, and yet nothing. The thrill of new riches faded quickly, replaced by boredom and suspicion. Jealousy brewed quietly among families. Cousins competed for favor, friends became rivals, and trust was a luxury few could afford. Loneliness crept into their castles like a shadow that refused to leave. Marriages were arranged for alliances, not affection. Husbands and wives often lived in separate wings, their interactions polite but distant. The idea of romantic love was reserved for poetry, not life. Many nobles found companionship only in their pets, hounds, falcons, or horses, creatures that asked for nothing but care. To talk openly, to confess fears or regrets, was impossible. Vulnerability was seen as weakness, and weakness was fatal. The nights were the hardest. When the noise of the court faded and the laughter died, nobles lay awake in massive, cold chambers, surrounded by silence. The flicker of a single candle could make the carved figures on the walls seem alive: saints, angels, beasts. Some found comfort in prayer, others in drink. The goblet of wine that once symbolized wealth now became medicine for the restless mind. They had gold, but no peace. They had servants, but no friends. They had palaces, but no home. Entertainment became a desperate distraction. Tournaments, hunts, and masquerades filled the calendar, each more elaborate than the last. But beneath the armor and velvet, the same emptiness waited. A tournament was not about bravery. It was about proving worth. A hunt was not about nature. It was about dominance. The mask of nobility never came off, not even when the music stopped. They could not be themselves, even when no one was watching. Some nobles turned to religion, seeking meaning in devotion. They built chapels, donated to monasteries, and attended Mass daily. Yet even faith was often tangled with pride. Their gifts were meant to buy salvation. Their prayers whispered for status as much as redemption. True humility, the kind found among peasants who had nothing but faith, eluded them. The noble's soul remained restless, forever searching for purpose in a world that demanded perfection but offered none. And as centuries passed, many nobles grew aware of the irony. They looked down from their castle towers and saw the peasants below, tired, poor, hungry, yet laughing around fires, singing after long days of labor. There was something real in that simple joy, something the rich could never touch. In their wealth, they had lost touch with life itself. As they aged, the emptiness deepened. Their children, raised by tutors and servants, became strangers. Their portraits hung in halls that echoed with forgotten laughter. The grand banquets that once drew hundreds now felt hollow. The gold and silver dulled beneath layers of dust. And in those final years, some nobles finally understood that the greatest curse of wealth was not greed, nor danger, nor jealousy. It was boredom, because to be rich in medieval times was to live inside a golden cage. Every comfort came with a price, every pleasure with a shadow. And while the poor dreamed of castles, the nobles dreamed of freedom, to live without titles, without rules, without the heavy crown of expectations. But such dreams were only dreams. The noble world was built on appearance, and appearance could never bend to desire, so the candles would be lit once more, the masks tied again, and the halls filled with laughter that didn't reach the eyes. The feast would go on, as it always did, until history itself grew tired of the act. To the peasants who toiled beneath the shadow of castle walls, the lives of the rich seemed touched by the divine. From the outside, their lives appeared effortless, gold crowns, endless feasts, and servants who bowed at every command. But if one could step inside that world of grandeur, the illusion would quickly shatter. For the truth was that being rich in medieval times was not only about privilege, it was about burden. A constant, suffocating burden that few could escape and fewer could understand. Power, in the medieval world, was not freedom. It was responsibility, expectation, and danger all wrapped together. A noble's every action carried consequence, not just for himself, but for his entire household, his lineage, his land, and the people who lived upon it. The higher one climbed, the less choice one had. Every smile, every alliance, every whisper was a calculation. To rule meant to be trapped in a web of politics that stretched across kingdoms, and the strings of that web were often sharp enough to cut. From dawn until dusk, a noble's day was dictated by duty. Meetings with stewards, arguments over taxes, letters from neighboring lords, disputes among peasants. There was no end to the matters demanding attention. Even the smallest decisions could spark conflict. A single decree about crop storage or market tolls could mean peace or rebellion. The nobles who survived were those who learned to wear patience like armor, to never show exhaustion, and to always appear certain, even when they were drowning in uncertainty. There was no privacy. Servants dressed them, knights shadowed them, advisors followed their steps. The castle, that grand symbol of power, was also a prison of stone. Every hall carried echoes, every wall hid ears. Secrets were currency, and betrayal could be bought cheaply. Even family could not always be trusted. Brothers plotted against brothers, wives spied for rival houses, and loyal servants were sometimes the eyes of the enemy. And then there was the church. Its influence loomed over all, sanctifying power, yet also threatening it. Nobles were expected to uphold Christian virtue while living surrounded by temptation and corruption. Every feast, every celebration risked offending the moral eye of the clergy. Yet, without the church's blessing, no noble's rule was secure. A single priest's sermon could shape the loyalty of an entire village. Thus, nobles walked a tightrope, flaunting wealth enough to show God's favor, but never so much that it appeared sinful. The constant pressure took its toll. Many nobles aged long before their time, their faces hardened by endless tension. Some turned to drink, others to prayer, a few to cruelty, as if punishing others could ease the weight on their own hearts. The fear of failure haunted them. A single poor harvest could spark rebellion. A single lost battle could erase generations of legacy. A noble's worth was not measured by happiness or peace, but by how long he could hold on to power without collapsing under it. Even sleep offered no escape. Many nobles dreamed of enemies, faceless rebels, jealous vassals, scheming relatives. Their nights were filled with the sound of imagined footsteps and whispered threats. Guards patrolled outside their doors, yet paranoia lingered inside. To be powerful meant to live in constant vigilance, never sure which hand might one day hold the dagger. For noble women, the burden took another shape, quieter but equally heavy. They were the keepers of reputation, the protectors of lineage. A single rumor could destroy their worth in the eyes of society. They bore children, not just for love, but for strategy, ensuring the survival of family alliances. Behind their silks and jewels lay exhaustion, the silent labor of managing estates, servants, and expectations without recognition. Many noble women prayed not for luxury, but for peace, a peace that rarely came. The irony was that nobles could never truly enjoy the world they ruled. The land was theirs, yet they rarely walked upon it freely. Their castles overlooked vast forests and rivers, but they could not wander those paths without guards and ceremony. Even their gardens, those symbols of peace and beauty, were carefully arranged to impress visitors, not to bring comfort. Everything, even beauty, was a performance. When famine struck or war loomed, the weight became unbearable. Nobles had to rally men to fight, raise taxes, and face the desperate eyes of their people. They were expected to be strong, wise, and merciful, all at once. Impossible ideals. To falter was to invite rebellion. To be too firm was to invite hatred. The crown that glittered in portraits was, in truth, made of iron, heavy, unyielding, and cold. In the quiet of their chambers, many nobles questioned the point of it all. What good was wealth if it could vanish with a single siege? What good was honor if it was built on fear? Yet they could never step away. The system demanded their participation. To abdicate power was to invite chaos. To keep it was to carry endless weight. And so they endured, year after year, pretending their burden was privilege, even as it hollowed them from within. By the end of their lives, the richest nobles often looked not triumphant, but tired. The spark of youth dimmed by years of vigilance and duty. They left behind lands, titles, and castles, but also a legacy of loneliness. For in medieval times, to rule was not to live, it was to endure. And so the peasants below looked up at the castle's glowing windows and whispered with envy, never knowing that behind those walls, the noble too was whispering, not with pride, but with quiet despair. Power in the medieval world was a double-edged sword, beautiful to behold, deadly to hold. The nobles who sat upon golden chairs rarely sat comfortably, for beneath the velvet and jewels lay a constant undercurrent of danger. To rule was not merely to command armies, it was to live surrounded by whispers, daggers, and envy. Every friend could be an enemy. Every smile could hide intent, and every shadow could carry a threat. The castles of the rich so admired from afar, were designed not for beauty, but for defense. Thick walls, narrow windows, and high towers spoke less of comfort and more of paranoia. Even during times of peace, guards patrolled day and night. Gates were locked at dusk, bridges raised, moats watched closely. The noble's home was both fortress and cage, a reminder that safety was never guaranteed. For the higher one climbed in rank, the more one had to lose. Inside these walls, betrayal was not the exception, it was expected. Power bred ambition, and ambition bred deceit. Cousins conspired against cousins. Vassals plotted against lords. Even sons sometimes turned against fathers. The struggle for inheritance tore families apart long before the grave did. A rumor, a forged letter, or a whispered accusation could shift alliances overnight. One moment, a noble was surrounded by allies, the next, by conspirators. Feasts and gatherings, outwardly filled with laughter and music, often masked these silent wars. The nobleman smiled across the table at the very man who planned his downfall. Every toast was a test of loyalty, every shared meal a quiet battle of intent. The poisoned cup was not a myth of the Middle Ages. It was a reality many feared. Servants were watched, tasters employed, and yet suspicion never rested. To trust was to invite danger. To doubt everyone was to live alone. Envy was another poison, flowing freely through noble veins. Wealth was never enough. One lord wanted more land, another wanted more titles, another sought the king's ear. The competition was endless and cruel. A single royal favor, a new estate, a position at court could ignite silent hatred among peers. Nobles spent fortunes on displays of grandeur, not out of joy, but out of fear of appearing lesser. Their banquets, their jewels, their castles, all built to remind others that they mattered. Yet the more they flaunted, the more enemies they earned. At court, the danger grew sharper. The royal palace, where power gathered like heat around a flame, was a place of constant maneuvering. Flattery was a weapon. Gossip was armor. The fall of one man meant the rise of another. Courtiers smiled as they exchanged compliments, but every word was loaded. One careless remark could end a career. One misplaced glance could spark suspicion. The king or queen, seated in majesty, often ruled through fear, ensuring that no one ever felt secure enough to rebel. Letters, too, became instruments of intrigue. Nobles sent secret messages by trusted messengers or coded symbols. A folded corner might mean safe, a drop of wax weight. Some hired scribes to forge letters, others to intercept them. Betrayal was written not only with daggers, but with ink. And when accusations arose, guilt or innocence mattered little. What mattered was who the king believed. Justice, like loyalty, was for sale to the highest bidder. Even alliances sealed by marriage could crumble under suspicion. A husband might fear his wife's loyalty, especially if her family belonged to a rival house. A wife might fear poisoning from her own kin's enemies. Love had little space to grow in a world ruled by ambition. Many noble unions began with hope and ended with silence, or worse, exile. Some women were sent to convents, not out of piety, but out of politics. Some men vanished on hunts that never ended. And then there was the ever-present fear of rebellion. Nobles ruled vast lands, but their control depended on the loyalty of their knights and peasants. One tax too high, one insult too sharp, and unrest could spread like wildfire. A peasant's revolt might start in a distant field, but its echo reached the castle fast. To the noble, the sight of torches in the distance was a nightmare, not because he feared death, but because it meant losing everything he had built. Power, once lost, rarely returned. The church added its own layer of danger. Excommunication, being cut off from God and society, was a punishment worse than execution for many nobles. A single accusation of heresy or blasphemy could destroy a lifetime of power. Rivals often used religion as a weapon, whispering false sins into the ears of priests. Nobles thus donated gold and built churches not only out of faith, but fear, hoping to buy divine protection in a world where no fortress could keep evil at bay. Amid all this chaos, true friendship became nearly impossible. Some nobles found brief solace in trusted advisors or childhood companions, but even that bond was fragile. Loyalty could crumble under gold or threat, and so the higher one's rank, the lonelier one's heart became. They dined at long tables, surrounded by laughter and music, yet felt utterly alone. The fear of betrayal haunted every conversation, every alliance, every night's sleep in such a world. Even joy was dangerous. To show too much happiness could provoke jealousy. To show fear invited exploitation. Nobles learned to wear calm like armor, to speak softly, smile faintly, and never reveal the storms beneath. They became masters of pretense, experts in hiding emotion. The poor might die of hunger, but the rich often died of worry, their minds consumed by schemes, suspicions, and the haunting knowledge that every friend was also a potential foe. And when betrayal finally came, as it often did, it came swiftly. A sudden arrest, a forged confession, a blade in the dark. Castles fell not from war, but from within. The noble, who once ruled with authority, might find himself imprisoned in his own dungeon, betrayed by those he had fed and trusted. Power, for all its splendor, was fragile. It glittered like gold and shattered like glass. Thus, the richest men and women of the medieval world lived not as free souls, but as prisoners of their own thrones, surrounded by beauty, haunted by fear, worshipped in public, cursed in private. Their crowns were polished daily, yet beneath them, their minds wore thin, because, in the end, the greatest danger of power was not betrayal, envy, or rebellion. It was loneliness, the kind that seeps so deep it silences even the heart's desire to hope. For every noble who rose to power in the medieval world, there came a time when fortune began to fade. The castles that once glimmered in torchlight grew cold and empty. The servants who once bowed deeply began to whisper behind closed doors. The coins that once flowed like rivers began to dry into dust. And in those quiet moments of decline, the rich discovered a truth the poor had always known, that nothing built by human hands lasts forever. The fall of a noble house rarely came suddenly. It crept in slowly, like winter frost stealing across a field. At first, it began with whispers, a failed harvest, a lost battle, a costly feast thrown in desperation to prove that wealth still flowed. Debts were ignored, letters from lenders unopened. Yet, even as the danger grew, the nobles continued to live as if nothing had changed. Pride was a cruel master. to admit weakness was worse than ruin itself. As the gold thinned, the cracks began to show. The great halls, once filled with guests, began to echo with silence. The musicians were dismissed, the cooks reduced to one. Silk gowns were mended and redyed, jewels quietly sold in distant markets. The nobles who once spoke of honor now spoke of strategy, how to borrow, how to delay, how to appear rich even when the coffers were empty. Image mattered more than truth. The illusion of prosperity had to be maintained at all costs, because once people believed a noble had fallen, the vultures would gather, and gather they did. Rival families moved in quickly, offering help that came with invisible chains. Loans disguised as favors, marriages arranged for control, alliances forged only to consume what remained. The church, too, demanded its due. Unpaid tithes, delayed donations, lands promised for salvation. The noble who once dined beside bishops might now kneel before them, begging for mercy. The same priests who blessed his rise would now remind him of humility for the first time. Nobles began to see the fragile threads that held their world together. Wealth was not just coin, it was faith, fear, and perception. When those threads broke, everything else collapsed. Servants fled without wages, knights turned mercenary. Even old friends avoided visits. The castle, once a living symbol of dominance, became a tomb of memory. The fire that once burned brightly in its hearths now flickered low, warming only dust and regret. The fall was not always financial. Sometimes it was political. A misplaced word at court, a failed alliance, a rumor of disloyalty. That was all it took. The king's favor was fickle, and when it turned completely. Lands could be seized, titles stripped, families exiled. The same nobles who once walked proudly in silks found themselves riding in plain carts, escorted by guards not of honor but of suspicion. History remembers kings and conquerors, but it forgets the countless lords who fell silently, their legacies erased by decree. In exile, the pain was worse. Those who had known luxury could not bear the simplicity of common life. The rough bread, the cold nights, the absence of servants to light fires or draw baths, these were shocks to the body and the pride. Some adapted, humbled by hardship, but many did not. They lingered in bitterness, dreaming of their lost estates, writing letters to monarchs who never replied. To lose power was to lose identity. Without rank, without status, they were ghosts in a world that no longer saw them. Even those who managed to keep their fortunes eventually faced decline in another form, age. The body grew weak, the mind slower, and the energy once needed to maintain control began to fade. Younger rivals circled like wolves. Children, raised in comfort, quarreled over inheritance before their parents had even died. Some nobles tried to hold on to everything until the end, clutching keys and seals with trembling hands. Others simply withdrew, retreating into solitude. Surrounded by relics of past grandeur, rusted armor, faded banners, portraits of ancestors who looked down in silent judgment. It is in these last years that the rich often realized the hollowness of their pursuit. The lands they fought for, the titles they defended, the gold they hoarded, none of it could buy peace. Servants came and went. Priests offered comfort, but nothing eased the ache of a life lived in pretense. Many nobles confessed in their final days not sins of cruelty, but of emptiness, that they had spent their lives pretending to be powerful, yet had never felt free. When death came, it did not discriminate. The poor died in fields. The rich died in chambers of carved stone. But the end was the same silence. The grand funerals were often smaller than imagined, the mourners fewer, the prayers shorter. Coffins gilded with gold still rotted beneath the earth. The names engraved on marble were worn away by time, just as surely as the peasant's wooden cross. In the end, wealth offered only one mercy memory. For a time, the noble's name might live on in records, his crest carved above a chapel door, his portrait hanging in a dusty hall. But even memory fades. The servants who once whispered his name grew old and died. The castle fell to ruin. The fields changed hands. Generations later, no one remembered the noble's voice, his laughter, or his fears. Only a few stones remained, marking where a dynasty once stood. Thus, the story of wealth in medieval times always ended the same way, not with triumph, but with quiet decay. The poor suffered visibly, their struggles laid bare beneath the open sky. But the rich suffered in silence, hidden behind walls too thick for pity to pass through. In the end, both met the same fate. The difference was only that the poor had known life's simplicity, while the rich had spent their days chasing shadows. The greatest tragedy of being rich was not losing fortune, it was never learning how to live without it. History, Johnny, is a strange mirror. It reflects not who people truly were, but who the world wanted them to be. The rich of medieval times believed that their gold and grandeur would buy them immortality, that centuries later, their names would still be whispered with awe, their castles still standing tall against the sky. But time is a ruthless storyteller. It erases, edits, and embellishes. The legacies the rich tried so hard to build often ended up as cautionary tales, stories of pride, vanity, and the fleeting nature of power. When we look at medieval paintings and tapestries today, we see glittering halls, radiant queens, and noblemen draped in velvet and fur. But those images were not mirrors of truth, they were illusions crafted by artists paid to flatter their patrons. A noble's portrait was less about who he was and more about how he wanted to be remembered. Even the grandest tombs, carved with solemn angels and golden crowns, were monuments to insecurity. Deep down, every lord feared being forgotten, and in that fear, they tried to buy eternity. But eternity does not come cheap. For every statue that stands, there are dozens that crumbled. For every name recorded in chronicles, hundreds have been lost. The scribes of history, often working under royal command, wrote what the powerful demanded. They exaggerated victories, softened failures, and omitted the cruelty that defined so many noble lives. In this way, the rich created their own mythology, a version of history where they were heroes, saints, and chosen rulers of destiny. Yet, when we peel away the layers of poetry and marble, what remains is often much darker. The truth is that most medieval nobles lived lives of immense waste. They consumed what others produced, fought wars that cost countless lives, and built monuments while peasants starved at their gates. Yet their descendants, centuries later, would look upon those same deeds as civilization. Castles became museums, crowns became relics, and the suffering that built them was quietly forgotten. The world remembered their achievements, not their debts. Their names, preserved in songs and stories, became symbols of romance instead of reminders of oppression. Still, not all legacies were erased by time's hand. Some endured not through pride, but through the traces left behind in culture and craft. The art, architecture, and literature funded by the rich often survived long after their names vanished. A noble might be forgotten, but the cathedral he financed still stands, its stained glass glowing like frozen fire beneath the sun. A lady's patronage of poets might outlive her title, her name remembered only in the corner of an illuminated manuscript. In this way, their wealth misused or not accidentally shaped the future, but legacy, like wealth, was unevenly distributed. The kings and queens of medieval Europe are still known to us, but the countless minor lords and wealthy merchants have faded into dust. Their castles turned to rubble, their family crests worn away. In some forgotten village, a farmer might plow his field over what was once a noble's courtyard, unaware that beneath the soil lies the bones of a man who once thought himself eternal. Time is cruel, but fair it devours everyone equally, rich and poor alike. Yet, humanity's obsession with wealth did not die with the Middle Ages. Even now, we repeat the same cycle, chasing comfort, chasing fame, chasing remembrance. The faces have changed, the palaces replaced by skyscrapers, but the desire is the same. Modern kings wear suits instead of crowns, but they still build empires that crumble the moment they are gone. The medieval rich feared the silence of oblivion, and in their fear, they left behind stories for us to tell. Perhaps that is their greatest success, not the life they lived, but the warning they left behind. Their legacies teach us that wealth is a double-edged sword. It gives power, but it isolates. It builds monuments, but it destroys empathy. The nobles of the medieval world were trapped in golden cages, surrounded by luxury, but starved of purpose. And when they died, the world moved on without them. What they thought eternal turned out to be temporary. What they dismissed as lowly, the songs of peasants, the prayers of monks, the words of poets, lasted them all. If you walk through Europe today, through the hushed halls of ancient castles, or the ruins of forgotten manors, you can still feel the ghost of that old arrogance. The stones whisper stories, not of glory, but of decay. You might see carvings of proud faces, but their eyes seem hollow, their smiles brittle. They wanted to be remembered as God's bedtime, with its quiet hand, turned them into dust and echoes. In a way, that is the truest form of justice the world ever offered. The poor, who had nothing to lose, are remembered in spirit through the songs, traditions, and folklore that survive. The rich, who had everything, are remembered only by their ruins. And so, history keeps its balance as you drift toward sleep. Imagine those empty halls, moonlight filtering through cracked windows, the sound of wind moving through corridors where laughter once echoed. The tapestries have faded, the fires are long dead, and the only voices that remain are those of the past. The great names of medieval wealth now belong not to the powerful, but to history's silence. They are reminders that, in the end, what we own means nothing. What we leave behind in the hearts of others, that is the only true wealth time cannot steal. In the dim corridors of history, there are countless forgotten throne seats, once gilded in gold and draped in silk, now nothing more than splintered wood buried beneath centuries of dust. The men and women who once sat upon them believed their power unshakable, their bloodlines eternal. They built palaces that touched the clouds and engraved their names upon every stone, convinced that history would bow forever before them. But power, like sand, slips easily through even the strongest fingers. And as centuries passed, those mighty thrones became reminders not of greatness, but of how quickly even the brightest empires fade into silence. For a moment, a grand medieval court, torches flickering against marble pillars, the scent of incense heavy in the air, the echo of boots striking stone as nobles bow before their ruler. The throne raised high upon a dais gleams beneath candlelight symbols of lions, eagles, and crosses etched into its surface. For the courtiers, that seat is more than a chair. It is destiny itself, the living proof that one man's will controls the fate of thousands. Yet, behind that illusion of grandeur lies a truth no one dares speak aloud. Every throne is temporary, every ruler replaceable. The moment a crown touches the head, it begins counting down to the day it will fall. The medieval world was a stage, and power was its most dangerous performance. Kings ruled not through love, but through fear, and fear is a fickle servant. One failed harvest, one lost battle, one whispered rumor could undo decades of dominance. History is filled with kings who went to sleep believing themselves untouchable and woke to find their banners torn down by their own soldiers. Castles that once rang with laughter became prisons. Crowns that once shone in sunlight were melted down to pay for debts. The same hands that cheered for their rulers often built the gallows on which they fell. And yet, every generation repeated the same mistake. Sons rose to inherit the power their fathers lost, repeating their pride, their arrogance, their blindness. They studied old chronicles, learned of ancient kings, and vowed never to share their fate, never realizing that by chasing power, they had already sealed it. The thrones they sat upon were haunted not by ghosts, but by lessons unlearned. Every kingdom carried the memory of its own collapse, hidden in its stones and soil. The people remembered, even when the rulers did not. The decay of power was not always violent. Sometimes it came quietly, disguised as peace. A ruler would grow old, his once firm voice reduced to a trembling whisper. Courtiers would begin to ignore him, speaking in hushed tones about succession and the future. His children, impatient and ambitious, would circle like hawks, waiting for the moment to strike. The old king would sit upon his throne, draped in furs and jewels, feeling the coldness, not of winter, but of irrelevance. It is a strange truth of history that the powerful rarely die in battle. More often, they fade in silence, forgotten long before their bodies are buried. When we wander through the ruins of old castles today, it is hard to imagine that they were once alive with power. The stones are cracked, the windows shattered, and the air thick with centuries of neglect. Yet beneath that decay lies the echo of command, the memory of voices that once declared wars, passed laws, and shaped destinies. Those voices are gone now, their echoes swallowed by time. What remains are questions. Who sat here? What did they dream of? Did they ever imagine that the world would one day forget them entirely? There is something deeply poetic in that forgetting. Power, which demands to be remembered, always ends in silence. The names of kings, once carved into marble, have been worn smooth by rain. The thrones that symbolized their might now rest beneath moss and shadow. Even the greatest empires, Rome, Byzantium, the Holy Roman Empire, eventually became stories whispered by historians to sleeping audiences. And that, perhaps, is the final humiliation of the rich and powerful, to become bedtime tales, told not with fear, but with drowsy indifference. The thrones themselves, once crafted from gold and ivory, often outlasted their rulers. Some were passed down through generations, others stolen, others melted and reforged into new symbols of authority. Yet the throne never truly belonged to anyone. It simply waited for the next occupant, indifferent to the rise and fall of those who claimed it. The wood, the stone, the metal, all of it was eternal, while the flesh that ruled over it was not. If a throne could speak, it might say, "You think you rule me, but I have seen you all come and go." In the twilight of the medieval world, when kingdoms began to fade and new powers rose from their ashes, the forgotten thrones became relic symbols of an era when power meant everything and wisdom meant little. Monks wrote their chronicles in candlelight, preserving what fragments they could, but even they could not capture the truth. Power cannot be preserved in ink. It is an emotion, a mirage, a dream that vanishes the moment the dreamer awakens. Today, we study these ruins and marvel at their beauty, forgetting the human cost behind every stone. We call them heritage and culture, but to those who lived then, they were prisons of ambition and fear. Every wall was built upon the backs of those who would never touch luxury. Every throne carved from the taxes of the hungry. The forgotten thrones remind us not of glory, but of consequence. As you drift into sleep, imagine one such throne standing alone in a dark hall. Its gold, long faded, its carvings eroded by time. Shafts of moonlight fall through broken windows, illuminating the empty seat. The air is still, the silence absolute. Somewhere in that stillness, you can almost hear the faint echo of a voice proclaiming itself eternal, only to vanish into nothingness. For, in the end, every throne is borrowed, every crown a lie, and every ruler, no matter how mighty, becomes dust beneath the same earth as his subjects. There comes a moment, Johnny, when even the richest among the rich begin to understand that all the gold in the world cannot hold back time. That moment is not loud, it doesn't come with the sound of battle or the echo of rebellion. It arrives quietly, like dust settling on a forgotten crown. It comes when the grand halls grow empty, when laughter fades from the corridors, when a noble wakes in the middle of the night and realizes that everyone he once commanded has long since gone. It is then that gold loses its meaning, and all the power once worshipped becomes a ghost of its former self. In the final years of the medieval age, wealth had lost its glamour. Those who had once built cathedrals and waged wars began to withdraw into themselves. The old nobles, heavy with age and regret, would spend their days walking through their estates, listening not to music, but to silence. They had won everything the world could offer: land, titles, respect, but found themselves prisoners of their own creation. The more they had, the more they feared losing it. The walls that were meant to keep enemies out now kept them trapped inside, surrounded by treasures that no longer brought joy. Their gold was no longer a symbol of triumph, had become a burden. Every coin represented the labor of peasants they had never met, the pain of wars they had ordered but never fought, the taxes that had starved families to feed their own greed. The realization came slowly, often too late. Wealth built on suffering cannot bring peace. Some tried to redeem themselves by donating their fortunes to churches and monasteries, believing charity might buy forgiveness. Yet even in their generosity, pride remained. They wanted to be remembered not for their sins, but for their repentance. The churches accepted their gold, of course, built new towers, commissioned new icons, and sang prayers for their souls. But deep within those sanctuaries, even the priests knew that no amount of coin could purchase salvation. The same hands that had crushed peasants in life now offered gifts to the altar in death. The same nobles who ignored hunger now begged for divine mercy. And while their names were carved into marble plaques and golden tombs, the poor they had forgotten lay buried in unmarked graves not far from their own time. As always, leveled the ground between them. As centuries passed, the graves of nobles and peasants alike sank into the same soil. The gold that once adorned the coffins of the rich was looted or lost, melted down to fund new wars, new rulers, new dreams. The legacies of power faded into dust, their stories reduced to fragments in forgotten books. The great families that once shaped kingdoms vanished, their names surviving only in the faint etchings of decayed stone. In the end, it was not wealth that endured, was the earth itself, silent and eternal. And yet, in that silence, there is a strange kind of peace. When gold loses its meaning, what remains is the truth of being human, the same hunger, the same fear, the same hope for meaning beyond possession. The rich, stripped of their titles by death, became what they had always been, beneath the silk and jewels fragile souls, frightened of the unknown. Their castles became ruins, their thrones forgotten, but their humanity lingered like a whisper in the wind. Sometimes, historians uncover their letters' fragments of the heart beneath the armor. You can feel the trembling hand that wrote them, the uncertainty behind every word. What will become of me? They asked, though they would never admit it aloud. Will I be remembered kindly? In those letters, there is no pride, no arrogance, only a quiet yearning to be understood. Perhaps that is the greatest truth wealth hides, that even kings crave the same comfort as beggars, to be seen, to be forgiven, to be loved. In the final twilight of medieval wealth, gold itself became a kind of illusion. As trade expanded and empires shifted, the coins that once symbolized unshakable power began to lose their value. Kingdoms that had ruled for centuries collapsed in a matter of years. The riches hoarded for generations were scattered across the world, and new powers rose to replace the old. The world moved on, indifferent to the dreams of dead nobles. Gold had lost its soul. It no longer carried meaning, only memory today. When archaeologists dig through the remains of that vanished age, they sometimes uncover golden rings, jeweled crosses, or fragments of crowns. They hold them gently, dusting away centuries of dirt, and in that fragile silence, you can almost hear the faint echo of a vanished world, a whisper of voices that once called themselves eternal. But to us, they are artifacts, curiosities, nothing more. The gold that once ruled nations now sits behind glass, admired but empty. It has no power left to command, no authority left to fear. And perhaps that is the quietest, most fitting end of all. The wealth of the medieval rich did not vanish in fire or chaos, it simply faded into irrelevance. The world learned to sleep without its kings. The thrones they built became symbols, their castles became ruins, and their gold became history. What they never realized, what none of them could, was that power was never the true prize. Peace was so, as you lie back, letting your thoughts drift into that hazy border between waking and dream. Imagine those long empty halls once more. The fire is gone, the air is cold, and the great stone throne stands untouched, blanketed in dust. Outside, the stars shine over fields where peasants once toiled, over rivers that have long since changed their course. The world moves on, and the memory of gold fades into silence. In the end, all that remains is the quiet, the endless, forgiving quiet that swallows kings and beggars alike. Gold loses its meaning, only peace remains.